Joining me today on the Oracles of Innovation podcast is Brian Culley, who's the Chief Executive Officer today of Lineage Cell Therapeutics. I met Brian in May this year at the iCelerator meeting ahead of ARVO, and we started talking. We ended up on a bench together, I think, Brian, and we just started talking. And the work that you're doing today and just kind of your background and everything led me to wanting to get you on this podcast. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, Kris.
Can you just give our listeners a little bit of a rundown of your career path, and then we'll dig in a little bit deeper?
Sure. I think it's been diverse. I guess, my formative years were spent in a lab, white lab coat, gene jockey, doing recombinant DNA for an academic lab here in San Diego and at Scripps Research Institute. I left to pursue a PhD. I never completed my PhD at Santa Barbara, and I actually went into industry. I started working at Neurocrine Biosciences, which has gone on to be a very successful company. I learned a lot about applied drug discovery there. So, building upon my academic background and understanding how things work, then applying those to drug discovery. And then I did a tour of duty through technology transfer at UC San Diego. I then pursued that, followed that rather with I got an MBA to kind of transition into business. I got into business development, which I did for a few years, and then ultimately I had an opportunity to take over a company that was really flailing, and it was my first opportunity to become a CEO, which is great because I was using both my scientific and my business background, and that's what I've continued to do. I've now been at my current company, Lineage Cell Therapeutics, for 7 years, and I can't imagine doing anything other than combining both basic research and business aspects into the furtherance of developing new medicines.
First question that comes to mind is what was the decision point that made you decide, okay, I'm going to pursue an MBA? I've done a lot of work in sciences. I have, this background in that area. So why then at that point in your career go do an MBA?
Yeah, the utility of an MBA and really the macroeconomic environment, meaning like, employment levels and things like that. These things vary, over long periods of time. So back when I was doing it, it was still viewed at that time as a very useful degree. I elected to go to Cornell because they had a very special program for people who were a little bit later in their career and were going through a transition. So it was a special program just for scientists and engineers. We were viewed as people who were really comfortable with mathematics. So we could get comfortable with the numbers. Maybe we weren't as comfortable with the social side, operations and strategy and planning and things like that. So they really built a bespoke program for people who had the background similar to mine. And I saw it as an important credibility stamp. I was someone who had spent all those years in the lab, and you really need to sometimes rely on indicators or proxies that you can, quote, handle the business world. And so, as a very analytical person, I mapped out a multi-year path, and it included obtaining an MBA. And so I did that. And, I'm really happy to say I rely on that degree almost every single day. It actually ended up being profoundly useful for my career. So it was great. It was fit for purpose, and it really paid off.
We actually have a program here at the University of Strasbourg, has a master's program called Masters in Innovation for scientific PhDs.
Hmm.
And
Wonderful.
most of our project managers come out of that program. They're PhDs or postdocs, and then but it's amazing how people don't often think of science and business as being related, or things that really kind of will mesh together. But in a lot of ways, what you learn, the math, how you go about identifying molecules and things like that, it's all problem solving.
Absolutely. And I still remember very clearly an article in The Scientist magazine describing what they called gold collar workers. So blue collar, tends to be more industrial, and white collar is more, office based. So the gold collar workers that they were talking about were people who could pull together aspects of science and business, and they were so precious, they were, worth gold. And as someone who was, content in the lab, but I really didn't want to have that be my, 3, 4, 5 decade professional life. I was looking for something, and that really spoke to me that I didn't have to abandon my scientific roots, but I could still embrace a business career. And it's really worked out exactly that way.
So before we started recording, I was talking about looking at your CV on LinkedIn and noticing that you took some time off to before you made changing from one job to another, and the phrasing you used was considerate. I think it was something along the lines of considerate job search, or and that caught my attention because most people will sort of wallpaper over the gaps in their CV, but you're quite open about the fact that you wanted to take time to look for your next move. Why did you view it that way, and how did it help inform your next career move?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is I described myself at one point in my career as an unhurried evaluator of biotech opportunities. And really what I had in mind there was that I wasn't just, the next person looking for a job, willing to take anything. I really wanted something that fit, something that made sense for me. And I had a, a reasonable but not, shocking exit from a prior company. So I had a little bit of breathing room. I had a year or two where I could really try some things. I'm not immune from hiding things in my resume. I also in my career spent a year living at 6,000 feet and trying to become a professional marathoner. So I did a sort of sabbatical that doesn't show up on my background, but at this other particular time, it was great because it allowed me to kind of indicate both for myself publicly as well as for people who are interested in my candidacy, to say fit was going to matter. I don't want to waste my time. I really want to work on things that I believe in and where I can make a difference. Even knowing that not every idea works out. Certainly, failure is a big part of the biotech industry. That's okay, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't wasting my time on just the next thing that came by because it was a job.
Right, right. So about this marathoner, um, was that, I mean, I take it running is a passion.
For 32 years, it was a real passion, but it's a bit of a hobby, and not
Okay,
even that at times.
yeah. But does that help? I mean, how does endurance running? Yeah, there are a lot of high level, C-suite people who do endurance sports.
Hmm.
Is there any kind of I'm not one of them, but um, how does that impact or inform or help you cope in a stressful leadership position?
Oh, wow. I think three things rush to my mind. One is, having I call it a sports background. That's how I approach our work. I always refer to it as a team. It sounds kind of hackneyed, but it's players have specific positions. You rely on them to do those things really well. You might not need them to do other things because you've got other people who are specific for that. So I try to have a flat organization and take a team approach and get everybody kind of in sync. Um, Another thing that I found is I did my best thinking while I was running, and it was really difficult for me when I was in my mid 30s, mid 40s. I'm still really climbing up that sort of that career ladder. Um, it was difficult to go out and go for a run, if the sun was still shining because I felt like I was, cheating
Mm,
myself. I should be at work. But I tell you, my brain just really, all of my best ideas have always come up when I've been out running. Now I'm in my mid 50s, and I'm sort of comfortable, I'm employable, right? I can go out and go for a run and say, I need this because I have a problem. If I go run even just like 3 miles, I bet I'll come back feeling much better about the opportunity. And so that's something. It's been helpful from a health perspective, I suppose, and an idea generating perspective. And then lastly, as a long distance runner, there are sort of these notions that it doesn't matter who's leading it halfway, right? You want to be leading at the finish line. That's where it
Mm-hmm.
matters. And I take that approach. Drug development is a very long cycle, and there are milestones along the way, but you really need to be developing something that can complete the entire event. And so that means commercial viability. You've got to be able to manufacture your product. You've got to be able to do that at scale. It has to be affordable. You're going to think about reimbursement. These are things you should be thinking about in the very first days when you're launching a new initiative. You have to be thinking about the totality. And I bring that approach that, there might be some difficult miles along the way, but what matters is, did you make it to the finish line? Because, hey, nobody remembers second place. So you got to get there
No,
first.
no, no. Yeah, some of the things that especially the team, and thinking about the challenges and thinking about every milestone along the way is something that oftentimes somebody who's just starting the journey of being an entrepreneur often doesn't think about because they're um so focused on the actual product itself. And as one of our board members says, they falling in love with your product can sometimes be the worst possible thing because you're sacrificing a lot of other things along the way.
hmm
So what was there, did you have a negative experience where the team was minimized, or how did your approach to working as a team in a fairly horizontal organization come about?
Um, I've been fortunate that in most cases I've been part of growth of organizations. That means we're adding. So I get to have my hand on the wheel in terms of the hiring. So the kinds of people that we want to have in the organization, the profile of how they go about solving problems. It ends up becoming sort of part of the DNA of a company. Occasionally, you find people that don't fit, and you have to kind of rotate them out. It's always
Mm,
unpleasant, but sometimes it's necessary. So I've been fortunate that a lot of the direction in terms of the culture of the companies, I've been able to have a significant input toward because of the need and the hiring practices which we employ.
do you look for a specific type of background, or is it more about the personality? Because especially when you're working in smaller teams, the hires become so critical. Is that
I
that
I
sort of perfect piece to the puzzle?
Yeah, we have there's sort of an inner circle, in the companies I usually work, your most trusted advisors, and there's a phrase that comes up usually after something good happens, and the phrase is, "This is how we do it." And it's actually kind of difficult to describe what we mean, but we see it and we know it when it happens. And really what it is it's not a background, it's not specific training. It's a manner of doing things. It's an
Mm-hmm.
approach, and it often includes important elements of of networking. It often includes important elements of persuasion. It often includes important elements of creativity. So, I'm loath to pursue something that is exactly how it's been done, the last three ways. I'm going to challenge whether the fourth way it's still relevant, and it may be. I'm not driving change just for the sake of driving change. That's disruptive, but approaching things in a new way can be really effective. And I try to applaud and recognize when somebody runs into a problem, finds a creative way of solving it. And I'll tell you one, because we're talking about, like, hiring and product development. I think a kind of cute example of this is, if you're hiring somebody for a regulatory role in a company, and go, well, this person's got 10 years experience, well, that person's got 20 years experience. Well, we just had incredible turnover at the top of FDA. I don't know if anyone has 10 years experience. No one has 1 year of experience, right? The FDA is changing, so
Mm,
everyone, it's new. So do you have the skill set to be able to navigate and discern and uncover what are the ways, what's important, how are things getting done, how are things the same? That is going to be as important as what happened, back in 2011 with that product you work on successfully at your big prior company. So
mm,
that's what I mean by the phrase, "This is how we do it." Yeah, we bring an approach to finding ways of getting things done, getting great returns per dollar spent, and it's not bullheaded. It's not taking no for an answer. Sometimes no is the right answer,
mm.
but really being both comprehensive in how we think of problems and also integrated, how all these things are tied together.
Yeah.
So that's really our approach.
We in my company we call it GSD, get done.
Yes,
Yeah.
we have a few of
Yeah.
those colorful acronyms that
Yeah.
that float around as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like it. You want something that people are going to hang on to and say, yeah, this is
Hmm.
what that looks like when we can do that. So,
Yep.
so when we met in May and we were talking about cell your company Lineage, and I have to admit, as long as I've been in ophthalmology, gene versus cell versus, all of this is a little bit, over my head. And I saw today that there was a first implant of a new, I think it was gene therapy treatment in London. Um, and it made me curious, and I didn't have time to go read more thoroughly, but what you're doing is producing cells for specific therapies in for ophthalmology and neurology, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, we're manufacturing in the lab RPE cells to treat dry AMD with geographic atrophy.
Geographic atrophy.
Yeah.
And you're
Yep.
working with one company in that specifically today, right?
We're partnered with Roche and Genentech on that
Mm-hmm.
program, but that program's been developed and ran through a phase 1/2A trial at Lineage.
Okay. And then the other work that you do is in there's another medical specialty, correct?
Yeah, we also have a cell transplant program in spinal cord injury,
Okay.
auditory neurons for hearing loss, and photoreceptors. So another eye program.
So where is the future? Is it gene therapy? Is it cellular therapy? What is more, I guess, from your perspective, more achievable in terms of therapeutic treatment?
It used to be an answer that was different some years ago, but we just had a 3-year update, and we showed that patients had increased vision and had increased the density of their key layers of the retina. That never happens in the natural course of dry AMD. You only get worse. So we sort of reversed. Those clinical observations are exactly the opposite, and they've been noted at year 1, year 2, year 3, and the difference between an untreated eye and a treated eye is just getting wider because the untreated eyes are getting worse. So, there's no approved therapy. There's no molecule or antibody targeting a single pathway that can have that kind of clinical effect. Gene therapy is quite interesting because yes, gene therapy can have a curative effect. The problem is you've got hundreds of inherited retinal diseases, and you fix one gene, you fix one small group of patients. But if you replace the cell, you're doing like 30,000 gene therapies simultaneously. So I think, and we're not the only ones now. Just this year, an additional one, two, three other companies, including Astellas, which is a pretty meaningful company. They've all come out and shown with their RPE cell transplants that they also have been able to increase vision in the setting of dry AMD. So, there was a time where I would have said, look, I think cell therapy is the only way to improve vision and cure this disease. But it would have been, a small company CEO making grand statements. Now
Mm-hmm.
I'm in possession of, very durable multi-year data from a single transplant of cells. And we're one of now four companies that have shown the impossible. So I really think it's much easier for me to say, quite convincingly that the future of this particular condition is in cell transplantation. And I'm hopeful that in other areas like spinal cord injury and other conditions where a
Hmm.
cell can do more, that will be part of that new branch of medicine.
Is there a point where cell therapy can help ir- reverse blindness?
I think if you were to talk to some of our patients, I mean, I don't know if I could describe it any other way. I
Yeah,
don't want to be. I appreciate that great claims require great evidence,
yeah.
I think at this point around the world, there are probably between 20 and 25 people that have had essentially, a reversion of their condition, meaning they have gained vision when they should be losing vision. And human beings can't regrow retinal tissue. Maybe a salamander or axolotl or starfish or something can do that, but humans can't. So when you see that, and it's coming, this is our data that's been collected by Genentech, a part of Roche. I mean, one of the best
Mm,
ophthalmology companies in the world, and they're going out there to major medical meetings and showing this evidence. So, this is not a spurious finding from some random company no one's heard of. Like
mm,
this is happening more and more frequently. I don't know when it becomes a consensus view that this is the future of this particular condition, but I think that the arc of innovation would suggest that, of course, you're going to have sophisticated people who become early adopters. And then as
mm.
that evidence grows, eventually you wake up one day and you go, my goodness, of course, we knew it all along, right? I still think I might be in the, he's crazy phase, but, I forget how that phrase goes, but, first they call you crazy and, then eventually they build statues of you or something like that. I think we're
Right.
still pretty early, but it's accelerating. That's what I find most exciting. Both the field and this particular application of cell transplants to GA is accelerating, and it appears to be working in independent hands. That's the ultimate test of science. Independent groups being able to find the same results.
Absolutely. And when you look at I was working on a presentation for a client the other day that's they have a device that allows for better management of patients between injections. And you look at the bolus of GA patients that are coming through between now and 2050 and beyond, and you just think, intuitively that the healthcare systems cannot manage that to do intravitreal injections, multiple intravitreal injections, in patients. So I would think that there is a desire in the scientific community, in the clinical community, to see success and see these cellular therapies move more quickly to commercialization if it's practical.
Yeah, I sometimes think about there's dry AMD in my family, and I think about someone in their 80s who starts to have enough sight loss that they really are seeking intervention. They go for care, um, and maybe they could get an anti-complement therapy because that's available and that's a monthly or every other month injection. So 6, 9, 12 injections a year. By the way, this is someone who can't drive, right, and has to
Mm,
get to a center and get those administrations, and for the rest of their life. And what do they get from that? They feel no symptomatic relief. They have a very small but existing probability of a catastrophic issue or in terms of safety. And what they get is, the progression of their disease slows by about 20% per year. The amount of tissue salvage over even 5 years it's almost negligible. It's this tiny little ring that has not been demonstrated to have any change in your vision. I mean, it's
mm.
the statistics are clear that you don't have a vision benefit. Everybody still loses their vision. So if you then contrast that with what our approach in development looks like, which is a one-time 30-minute transplant to surgery. It's a different group, right? So it's not a poke and push. It's a surgical intervention. But, people in their 80s have probably had a few surgeries over the years. You lay down there, 30 minutes later, you're coming out, and that's it. It's a one-time dose. And you may enjoy an increase in vision that lasts for years. We don't know how long it's going to last. We've never had a case of rejection. I suppose you could redose if you needed to. We've never had to try that. That's a future exploration. I just think that, we've seen evidence that you can make the area of atrophy smaller, or at least, stop its progression. So it's, I think of blindness as it's this cliff, and you've got this car going 100 miles an hour toward the cliff, and it's like one therapy lets you slow the car from 100 to 80. Okay. Our therapy kind of throws the car in reverse. Well, I really think it's an easy decision for the patient. I hope that the provider community will similarly see the opportunity to, bring life-changing therapies to patients. But there's a lot of complexity in when you get out to the commercial end of it. And I'm glad, very glad that, that's for Roche to sort out, not for
Mm.
Lineage to sort out. We don't have that capability.
Well, that does bring up a good question. How scalable is cellular therapy today?
I'm really glad you asked that, because many people who I encounter, when they think about cell therapy, they really think about T cell therapy, which has been
Mm.
incredible for cancer, curative in cancer. But these are custom therapies, right? I'm going to take T cells from your body, I'm going to edit them and replace them. So, it ends up $300, $400, $500,000 for these therapies. But what we do is completely different. We are manufacturing RPE cells. We're already manufacturing. It's between 2 and 3,000 doses in a 3-liter bioreactor. So a milk jug, right? Thousands
Mm.
of doses from a milk jug, and we have not pushed the limit. But it's done in a bioreactor, so it's a closed system, which means the risk of scale up is lower than if you were trying to do the same thing on flat plastic plates. You'd need many soccer fields worth of plastic to try and make that what we make in a milk jug. So we've been able to lower. We don't guide to this, but it's quite remarkable how low the cost of goods can be. And the reason is that the cells are self-renewing. So these cells divide without changing. So you have, in a way, an unlimited supply of starting material. And then we take those undifferentiated pluripotent stem cells and we run them through our process to make them into retina cells, and only retina cells. So that's how we're able to get an off-the-shelf therapy. Even the handling. I mean, this is a ready-to-use formulation. You thaw them out, and 5 minutes later, they're ready to go into the patient. So it is a completely different way of doing cell therapy that I really think is, people need, and I hope will, slow down to understand exactly how we're doing things differently to be commercially viable, rather than, I certainly wouldn't want to be developing a $500,000, injection for people who are 80 years old. Like, it just doesn't justify the quality years.
Yeah, and that is a question I think that's probably going to come to a lot of people's minds, because you think about gene therapy, and the price tag that you hear on some of these injections right now is, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Yeah, the individual can't afford that. Insurance systems are going to balk, healthcare systems are going to balk.
Yeah.
So if you can find a system, a solution that does that for at a lower price point and provides a substantial benefit, I would think that people should be lining up.
That's our plan. We'll
Yeah.
see how it goes, but yeah, it's important, it's really interesting, because even just this year, we've really seen the attention growing finally on the economics of the manufacturing side. So people have led with clinical data because it's exciting, and that's normal and fine. But when you see this exciting clinical data and people start scratching the surface and realizing, oh, you actually don't have a line of sight on your manufacturing. You haven't reduced to practice, a banking system that can actually support your product. Well, in the small molecule world, you just throw money at it and it gets fixed. Some of the technologies that are out there being developed, right, they are commercially infeasible. and it's sort of this ugly secret that hasn't been fully, seen. Now, not in every case. I certainly think that there's a lot of really great stuff out there, but I think those are important questions that investors need to ask so that the field is being smart about where it deploys its capital, so that we're not just generating great clinical data, which is nice, but actually getting products to people and around the world in an affordable way.
Is there a point in time where cell therapy leads to curing certain diseases?
Yes, I think that we have seen some extraordinary clinical outcomes in areas like type 1 diabetes, where people have taken islet cells, transplanted them to individuals with severe diabetes, and been able to regulate their glucose and keep them within their target zones. We've seen reports in the world of Parkinson's, where people have used dopaminergic neurons and transplanted them right to the substantia nigra in the brain in order to alleviate or reduce symptoms of Parkinson's. These are places, these are conditions where you're losing a specific cell. You lose the islet cell, you've got dysfunctional glucose regulation. So let's make islet cells and transplant them. You lose your dopaminergic neurons, you lose your auditory neurons, let's replace them. So yeah, when Bayer went from phase 1 to phase 3, or when Vertex or Sana, or there's this company in China, what they're doing in diabetes, like these are really beautiful applications, really in the same ballpark as what we're doing in dry AMD, of cell therapy. Now, it's not going to be useful everywhere. I don't happen to think that, I don't think you'll ever solve hair loss with cell therapies, right? But there are places where it seems like it could be really applicable and useful. And now we're finally getting the evidence, and not from, insignificant companies, right?
Mm,
Astellas, Bayer, Roche, like this is not like, micro cap biotech land. These are really valid, viable companies that are doing this work.
right. So what kind of time horizon are we thinking? Yeah, if especially for GA, which is obviously the a big focus in ophthalmology today. So
Yeah,
when
yeah, impossible
hi,
to know because yeah,
yeah.
it's the regulatory process. There are some things that can be accelerated. We will rely on our partners to assess the best way. But I will say that one of the things that I note that I think is interesting about our program is that because I said earlier, human beings cannot regrow retinal tissue. Um, there should be an event rate of 0 on a control arm, right? You
Mm,
should never see regrowth of retinal tissue. In fact, you really should never see an increase in vision on a control arm. So
right.
if you're doing that, if you have an intervention that is leading to anatomical changes that are adding tissue, um, or increasing vision, from a statistical perspective, it should not require a large trial and thus not as much time as if you had a background, right? If you're trying to show that you reduce the expansion of GA by 20%, I guess you need about, 800 patients per arm. So you don't need that when you've got a really clear clinical effect. But I don't know, or that's a big thing with Lineage is we're waiting to see what Roche and Genentech are going to do. Will they continue the program? Are they seeing enough data? Because it's a study that we don't see open label. They haven't reported any data, so we
Hmm.
don't know what the plan is. Are they going to continue it? And if they are continuing it, what does it look like? I don't even know when that happens, but I'm confident that we chose the right partner and they'll do the right thing, in the furtherance of that asset.
Yeah, and the other, I don't think Bayer or Astellas have reported any m- long-term significant results, have they? At this
Um,
point, it's just more kind of
Not in
rumors.
No, and actually, Astellas came out. I think they had 6-month data or maybe twelve
Okay.
month data on 3 patients. So, and they said that they were going to make a decision whether they would advance it to the next stage of development. This is fairly fresh information. So it's really kind of interesting about seeing them with their RPE suspension, and it's just a suspension. There's no scaffold. It's not. It's both complicated and uncomplicated, but really, this is just a suspension of cells delivered to the subretinal space, having these really remarkable clinical effects.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
It
I
really,
think so.
it really is. So I guess we'll have to see what's going to come out in at EU Retina in 2 weeks, and then at the Academy in October if there's any significant announcements coming out from these companies. So
Yeah, yeah.
Anything else to add that I haven't asked you about today, Brian?
Oh, I could go on for hours, but no, I think we did a nice job of kind of introducing people to what's going on in GA. It's definitely an area that to keep an eye on. Sorry about the pun, but yeah,
No
it's
pun
really
intended.
there's been just some incredible breakthroughs there, and they're going to start to be noticed.
Yeah, it is an exciting time. Thanks for joining Oracles of Eye Innovation today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Kris.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Oracles of Eye Innovation podcast. If you have an idea for an upcoming podcast or would like to be interviewed, please contact us at the email address in the podcast show notes. Until next time, I'm your host, Kris Morrill.